All right. Welcome everybody. I'm here with Dr. Chad Radwan, who actually was the lead researcher and writer of the Druze video on Religion for Breakfast. Welcome to the show, Chad.
Thanks for having me.
So you're the type of researcher that I'm a big fan of because, I'm a historian. I deal with people that lived 2,000 years ago. I deal with ancient sources, ancient archaeology, but you deal with alive people, which means in-person interviews, ethnography, just like really intense cutting edge research, which I think is awesome. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your research, your PhD dissertation research in particular. What did you study?
So one thing I'd like to mention to kind of respond to that is that, yeah, I remember that you had a background in archaeology yourself. But for myself, I come from an applied anthropology program, specifically applied anthropology. But it doesn't mean that, we don't take theory seriously and incorporate it in our work, because we definitely do. But for us, we sort of approach our research in terms of, is there a problem and can my bit of research start to ameliorate that problem? So what I studied essentially was the Druze community and what I believe is our seminal issue. And I say our seminal issue to take another step back and mention that I am Druze. And that's particularly important in terms of, having the right distance from the research and from the topic at hand, and not interjecting my own assumptions as much as listening to what folks have to say. So kind of circling back around to that idea of, yes, as applied anthropologists, we're always doing research that's contemporary. We're always doing our very best to include the voices, the opinions, the definitions, the perspectives of the individuals that we study. So the seminal issue among the Druze that I went in thinking I had experienced in my life was a lack of familiarity with our faith and our history, and I perceive those how do you say, those dearths, those lacks, as sort of a collective knowledge gap that wasn't doing any of us a favor.
And where does that collective knowledge gap come from?
So I'll kind of start to move a little bit away from my own opinion on it, as much as as far as what individuals kind of shared with me. So for me, it was important to say, is this knowledge gap real, right? And to ask folks whether or not that was the case and how they define that knowledge gap, in part by asking them what they thought was at risk for loss in their community. And so for me, this knowledge gap really was leading to this idea that, it's important to preserve one's culture, one's heritage, and one's, what have you, shared identity. And, to understand what that idea as far as heritage goes meant to Druze individuals, you really kind of dig in your heels and ask them, what do you value here? How do you relate to the community? What do you think is at risk? And what essentially emerged with this idea was, well, starting from our foundation as individuals, we lack this knowledge about the basic tenets of the faith, which was a little distressing.
I find that so interesting because it's really a religious literacy topic. Religion for Breakfast is all about religious literacy. And I've always described that as, not just knowledge about, a particular religious community, but also like being able to recognize how religion plays in politics and culture, like so many different aspects of it. But here it's kind of like self-religious literacy, what you were studying, like self-reflective religious literacy for the community.
Yeah, it was self-reflective, reflexive in that way, wherein individuals had to say what the problem was, rather than someone on high saying these people do not do X, Y, and Z. They do not read their religious texts, and they do not participate in Thursday night prayers and that kind of thing, if those are the parameters of what one considers religious literacy.
Sure. So let's get into the specifics then. So you specifically went to Lebanon, right? Or where did you conduct your research?
I did. I went to Lebanon, and this was after having done my thesis, my master's research on the Druze in North America. And in North America, I kind of use that term loosely because it was mainly a large sample of folks from the U.S. and a smaller sample of folks from Canada, which is where you predominantly find Druze in North America, although I've heard that there's some in Mexico and so on. So after having done that and tried to formulate this idea for what Druze identity means in the diaspora, I was particularly interested in knowing what it meant, of course, in the countries of origin. And for myself, yes, I am Druze, but I had only been to Lebanon one time prior to that. At the tender age of 27. And the second time I went was for my dissertation research, and I lived there for about 7 months. And I immediately, actually before having gone, I started to become aware, but I acutely became aware of the fact that in Lebanon, knowledge of the basic religious tenets and history of the community was lacking even more. Now, do Druze in Lebanon lack sort of engagement with their cultural identity? No, not so much. In the diaspora, that's easy to sort of put aside, but not in Lebanon. But the lack of knowledge was significant, and maybe more so than what I saw in the U.S.
So you basically interviewed Druze there then, and it's not like you were quizzing them about religious knowledge, right? Like how did the research go forward, and how you kind of discovered this knowledge gap?
Right. I think even looking back on my thesis, I did ask folks to define or ask, we have a religious symbol, the five-pointed star, five-colored five-pointed star, and ask folks, can you name what those colors mean and what they represent? And for the dissertation, speaking of folks in Lebanon, I didn't need to ask that. Of course, that came up repeatedly as an example of, I don't even know this. So, I could sort of expand on the questions I asked, but once again, they kind of related back to these larger themes of, do you feel like you're, an integral part of the Druze community, something to that effect. So I wanted to know how they would discuss community, how would they discuss shared identity and cultural heritage, and there are these big, broad terms that mean so many different things to different people. And in a way, that's good. The convenience of a term like heritage was an asset in this case, because I wanted to hear and kind of give folks space for defining it any which way they could. And I also want to give folks space to tell me, in the few instances that, sort of let it all burn, I'm not interested, that kind of thing. And I can talk a little bit about why I think folks may have had opinions similar to that in a few instances.
You mentioned the word heritage. One of the things that your work seems to be doing is talking about heritage and how we should understand heritage conceptually. You write that heritage is a process by which individuals create meaning in their lives. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I borrowed a lot of that phrasing. I can't remember exactly how much, from an anthropologist and archaeologist named Laura Jane Smith, who was one of the few folks saying what I was thinking when I went to do my literature review in depth in my graduate program. And she was saying that heritage is a process of meaning making. And I believe I added something with my advisor's advice about in and for the present. So it's very much alive. It's very much here now. We can talk about heritage in terms of archaeological sites, heritage tourism, which are sort of the two most popular ways that heritage gets discussed in the anthropological literature. And it was surprising to me, right? Because heritage is not a word that we shy away from in the US. It's used everywhere. And it's used in such a myriad of ways when folks talk about their Southern heritage, and some may link it to the rebel flag, where you'd see these bumper stickers say heritage, not hate, without going into more criticisms on that. Heritage is this really, really broad thing. And I had to sort of, say what I thought was obvious, and that heritage is really this process that individuals were using to define themselves, their past, and the communities that they link to in the present. So I also had to say intangible cultural heritage. But, speaking to an audience of anthropologists, it's important to kind of always, make yourself clear.
So something that we've been talking about is that there's this kind of knowledge gap that is affecting cultural inheritance for Druze community members, especially, it seems, diasporic Druze community members. Could you spell out why that's happening? Does that have something to do with the initiation process and some of the esoteric elements of Druze belief, or something else going on there?
Yeah, I'm trying to organize my thought process in terms of two things you kind of hinted at there, but you asked me about the how and not so much, maybe something we'll touch on in a bit, as to what are the effects, right? What are the effects of a knowledge gap having on the preservation of cultural heritage? If you use your creativity, for anybody out there listening to this, it's not a big gap to kind of bridge. You could see how the two are connected, but why that's happening, why essentially there's a dearth of resources focused on things like religion and history specifically. It's partly because there's a lot of what do I want to say here? There's a lot of beliefs that, in order to learn about our faith, we should become initiated. We should become sheikhs. And it's always important to note, because this is not widely known for non-Druze, that among the Druze, women and men are sheikhs. And I've read somewhere before that, for us, sheikhs, and I'm using it sort of in an American phonetic pronunciation, sheikhs or mashayikh in our case, make up something like possibly 15% of the entire Druze population in the Middle East. And so it's sort of a lifestyle and a philosophy that one should adopt. And that lifestyle is pretty austere. And it's sort of to do away with the material life and to, focus on the faith. So I think there's been a lot of very strong opinions that have taken that to an extreme, to where it's now sort of looked at that it's haram, or it's not good to learn anything about the faith or to have access to sort of any level of knowledge without devoting oneself, becoming initiated, becoming a sheikh. And what's interesting is that I found when you really confront folks with that dilemma, to say, do you really think that, one should become initiated to learn what I would always contextualize as the basic tenets? Almost nobody said yes, including Mashayikh, to say, yes, one should devote themselves to learn anything about the faith. No, because you got to have a starting space. And right now, I think that there's an increased need or want to have that sort of elementary knowledge of our faith among Druze all over the world, like our Muslim, our Christian, our Jewish, our whatever examples you want to give, counterparts.
You mentioned like educational resources. Are you envisioning, something as simple as like a YouTube video? Or are you talking about like a university or something? Because like there's Catholic universities, there's evangelical universities, there's Muslim universities. So there's like many different resources in these other Abrahamic faiths. Just textbooks and publishing houses. Like there's such an apparatus. Like, what are you envisioning when you say, educational resources? There's
such a lack of educational resources, in my opinion. And based on what I've heard over and over, that you could name any example, and I think the Druze lack it. So one interesting example that kept coming up for me was when folks would say, in Lebanon in specific, that, Christians have these movies that come out, and especially around Easter. And so, we're not saying let's make movies for one another and big budget films that talk about, our religious beliefs, but sort of anything would be a good starting point. There are and there have been efforts to teach young Druze and Druze who are interested in things like history and things like religion. So it's a really broad spectrum of what we lack and where we should start. What I envision though is something perhaps like an organized compendium that's accessible via the web or something like that, where folks can get synopses on all the literature that's out there. It always surprises me when people aren't familiar with some of the basic literature, and one should know that some of it is pretty in depth, and it's not that approachable, but there are some things that one could start with.
Yeah. I mean, just from my perspective, I would have appreciated some sort of lit review or bibliography online, because I had trouble finding research on this topic and scholars on this topic. I found you through Googling, and you had a really good interview with an anthropology podcast on YouTube, and that's how I found you to help me make the Druze video on Religion for Breakfast. But even from a scholarly perspective, I was kind of struck by the lack of available scholarship. Do you have like a sense on what the scholarly field of Druze studies looks like?
I could say one thing, to kind of ground this is through my academia.edu webpage that, many of us develop after graduating. I've gotten notifications about more and more folks publishing on the Druze. And I think a lot of it is really done at the graduate level. And that's perfectly fine, especially if some of those folks are able to get published. But I think that there is more being said. There's more being looked at. But those, to kind of backtrack on something I said, is those aren't necessarily good examples of educational resources to teach the Druze about themselves and to sort of hype up and encourage and support an interest in one's own cultural identity, which is a big task, right? But you got to start somewhere.
Right. Like so much of this is scholars outside looking in, as opposed to, self-reflective, material for, Druze children, for example.
That's right. And I think so little of the scholarship involves the active voices of Druze individuals. A good bit of it, I think, is done by Druze academics. And not that it has to be, but going back to the idea as to whether or not any of these pieces of literature serve as a good basis or foundation for folks to learn about themselves, for Druze individuals to learn about themselves, is definitely debatable. But some of it's a good starting point, and one can kind of explore the literature more and more, with a critical eye.
At the risk of asking too personal a question, how you mentioned that you yourself are Druze, and this is, I imagine you spent maybe 10 or more years on this project. Did you learn anything about yourself in the process of your field work?
I don't think I've ever been asked that. Did I learn something about myself? No, I'm sort of heartened by the idea that I studied something that I still believe was just as important as the day that I came up with the idea, probably very early on in my master's program, which is like 16 years ago now. I say that because, I took it upon myself to go to Lebanon to do this piece of research that involved something like 112, it was 91 interviews, I could remember that, and 112 individuals. And you have that slight difference because I did about 6 or 7 focus groups. And I did it on my own dime, and I'm very proud of that fact. And I also did it in a way where I was approaching this really broad term like heritage and this really broad issue, like how does this community preserve itself? And I tried to sort of problematize that and couch that in a way where it was linked towards, these educational resources, because that's what was standing out to me. So, what did I learn about myself? I feel good that I've done a piece of research that hopefully is and will continue to serve as a foundation for more in-depth, more detailed, and more nuanced research on this seminal issue. And you cannot study this issue, in my opinion, without speaking to Druze individuals. And I still see that is the exception to the host of research out there and the host of academics that have taken it upon themselves to study the Druze at some point in their tenure.
Yeah, I mean that's such a great thing about your research is there's like this practicality to it. Like it serves as a roadmap of what's to come. Like my research is not not particularly practical. It's 1500-year-old Greco-Roman rituals, but this is like, hey, this is an actual issue that's happening, and tries to identify a problem that could be fixed. Do you have any like aspirations yourself to be that person? Like, I'm a content creator. Have you thought about being like a Druze content creator to be that person?
I don't know. I know I'd like to continue my research, and that's a difficult thing to do with other working responsibilities. I've been with the Department of Veterans Affairs for, I don't know, almost 4 years now. And I love the research that I get to do with vets on any variety of topics, including suicide prevention and all this sort of thing. But I just don't see myself not pursuing something on the Druze. And at this point, we're sort of taught that, yes, you did this big piece of research. It was fantastic, but it was somewhere like 2014. Your data are dated. And so, yes, I'd like to collect some additional data, especially since, it is true, since 2014, Lebanon has seen a lot of changes. But the issue persists, it remains, and it hasn't been addressed as far as I know. But I'd like to return to Lebanon. I've returned, I think, twice since having done this research. And I was able to speak at a great conference hosted by the American University of Beirut to celebrate the Druze millennial anniversary, 1,000 years since its founding in 1017. That conference ended up taking place in 2018, but nonetheless, it was a really, really great conference to be a part of. I said it should be relatively obvious to bridge the gap between this problem that we've set up in the research, which is a lack of educational resources on Druze history and basic dogma. And how does that link to sort of preserving Druze culture? I think it is an easy gap to bridge in most folks' minds, but it was also a really deep chasm to delve into. So enough with the metaphors, but to say that, when individuals, and this is pretty big here, I suppose, in anthropology and sociology and other fields, but when individuals lack that knowledge, then they sort of lose their interest and participation in a discrete community wanes. And how does that participation wane? Well, let's remember that the Druze do not proselytize, and so our numbers don't increase, through proselytization, nor do the Druze practice exogamy. We practice. It takes a while for me to kind of move into the we and not the they, which I was taught in academia is what you do to supposedly remove yourself from the research equation. But if endogamy, marriage within the community, is not practiced, and this is the parameter for maintaining its numbers, that's clearly an issue. And so does that link directly to basic knowledge and how one, yes, I mean, it does. And through how we shape our individual identity, and, the lines are blurred between our individual and our community, our individual identity and our shared identity, our sense of community. That's, it gets a little philosophical, but as an anthropologist, I can't help but try to kind of dip my feet in everybody's waters, whether it's philosophers or sociologists or what have you.
And how does the diaspora play into this? So I feel like, you're separated from other Druze in Lebanon and Israel and the Golan Heights by, thousands and thousands of miles. And there's also possibly language barriers and stuff like that. Is there like an aspect of your own research or your own opinion about, intangible cultural heritage being, stymied in some respect by these cultural and geographical distances of Druze communities in the diaspora?
Mm-hmm. Speaking for the American Druze diaspora, as I was mentioning just before we started this conversation, there is something called the American Druze Society, and it's over 100 years old. I can't remember the exact year that it was started. It had a different name back then. but something like maybe 1906 or something like that. And what's interesting to know is that that earlier group was first established by sort of the men who had left Lebanon and maybe parts of southern Syria and so on, and come to the U.S. and set up shop, and still had this camaraderie. And then women came as well, and families were made, and people kind of set up their homes here in the U.S. But for the first 40, 50 years, meetings and sessions of the American Druze, what eventually became the American Druze Society, were all conducted in Arabic. And in some time in the 50s or early 60s, that changed to English, and it became known as the American Druze Society. So groups like that have made efforts to develop educational resources and to be a resource of enculturation, where folks get together at annual conventions and get to know one another, and sometimes find a marriage partner, or to attend a talk. I've spoken at conventions numerous times, and we've hosted great scholars, international scholars on occasion, about a variety of topics like reincarnation and so on. So sometimes you have this little bit of a feedback loop where it's like knowledge in these resources may be developed in the West and go back to the East. At least maybe some inspiration for Druze in Lebanon to look at their counterparts in the US and to say, look, despite the cultural differences, these folks in one way or another are clinging to their Druzeness.
And that's fascinating. The work you're doing is so interesting. I don't have any content questions left, and I want to open it up to you, Andrew, if you've got more. But I mean, one place that I don't know, I would love to just create space, Chad, for you to talk any more about where you are with your scholarship. You've mentioned that you're out of academia, that you've done this research that was really important and impactful, that you researched in 2014. What does the future look like for you and Druze scholarship?
I'd like to return to Lebanon and do at least a handful of interviews, both among the experts, whether they're sheikhs or involved in some of the educational resources that are available to Druze in Lebanon, as well as Druze youth and other Druze individuals. I also found some efforts among older Druze individuals getting together and making their own reading groups, and sort of delving into the religious texts on their own, or sometimes with the advice of a sheikh, I suppose. Anyhow, I'd like to explore that more with a small number of in-depth interviews, and to kind of take this foundation to the next level. It'll be more narrow, but it'll add some nuance to maybe the applied aspect and how this can be ameliorated, and what educational resources might really look like in the future. I talk about the importance of grassroots movements and the youth, but the youth is such a generic thing to throw around, and you find that at among so many American Druze Society conventions. It's always about the youth, and I don't think that the American Druze Society is doing a great job of engaging with the youth, especially those youth who are born and raised in the U.S., and to look at what their needs are. I want to say our needs, but at my age, I'm moving out of the youth category.
Yeah, I understand that too. I don't have any specific questions either. I do want to reflect a little bit just on the process of making the YouTube video, and thinking what else you think the general public should know. So in the video that we crafted, we talked about the establishment era, we talked about some basic beliefs and practices, but what would a episode 2 look like that the audience should know about, going forward in history, maybe to the 21st century?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's sort of placing what we learned in terms of this is what the community looks like now, and that's also a bit generic to say, but what the community looks like now is that there's a number of issues that involve different contexts, like economic issues that may affect whether or not Druze marry fellow Druze and are able to put the big weddings on that some parents require and so on. So there's all sorts of different contexts that come into play. And I think exploring those a little bit in an episode 2 would do a service to the Druze community and would maybe open a discussion among some Druze individuals to explore. Now, getting back to the other Andrew's question earlier, is that I think it was difficult to write that first episode. And it was difficult in terms of trying to write to an audience. It was kind of at a starting point, and at the same time, you're trying to say something new about what's been said before about the early establishment of the Druze. But that was sort of the intention, right? I think it does serve as an educational resource for young Druze. Hopefully, it will serve in that capacity and give people maybe a starting point, and maybe it's easier to listen to something and to watch the beautiful visuals that you're putting together, Andrew, rather than picking up one of these books here.
That's really all I got. Is there something that we really haven't touched on?
No, I think we did a good job of kind of exploring some of the more, complicated facets without really getting into those things that are talked about in the video so much. I appreciate this. I think it was a great conversation, and I've always got more to say. But I think, we approached it from this large perspective and probably did a pretty good job of having this conversation.
Well, great. Thanks for joining us, Chad. And I hope to keep in touch going forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew and Andrew.
And thank you, Chad. That was great.